We are very happy not just to have Paola Iovene here, but to have her back here since she finished her PhD in our department in East Asian literature in 2007. And so she is familiar to many of us. And I was even fortunate enough to have her work with me in Intro to China in her time here years ago. She published a book last year, Tales of Future Past, Anticipation and the End of Literature in Contemporary China with Stanford University Press, and this being the culmination of several years' work while at the University of Chicago, which is where she's been teaching since leaving us in 2007. She's also published in the Journal of Chinese Cinema and Opera Quarterly. She's very interested in Chinese cinema and documentary films, as well as Chinese literature. Has a project on rebellion and romance in late 70s Chinese cinema. But is here to talk to us today about a new project she's working on, which looks at the politics and poetics of air. It's a sort of a cultural, intends to be a cultural history of climate change, bringing together environmental studies and literary studies together, and that's the topic that you'll share with us. Yes, so please help me welcome Paola.
Thank you, Professor McNeil, for your very kind introduction and for inviting me here. It's really an honor, a pleasure to be back here and to see some of my very esteemed teachers, mentors in the audience, and to see so many of you. I have to say, I'm very intimidated. This is the largest crowd I've ever had at a lecture, maybe because, partly because at the University of Chicago classrooms tend to be small, but partly because also of other reasons, perhaps. Except when indeed I was Robin's TA in Introduction to China, and kindly he let me teach a class once, and that was probably still the largest audience I have, and it was in Robin's class. But thank you very much all for coming. And also I want to thank Nayet for helping me with the logistics and responding to so many emails and helping me with many, many things. So my talk today examines how recent fiction and documentary films have addressed the problem of air pollution in contemporary China. Much of this is work in progress, so I really look forward to hearing your reactions and your questions. I hope we'll have enough time for those. As Robin mentioned, this talk is part of a new research project, Poetics and Politics of Air, which attempts to combine a cultural history of climate modification in China since the 1950s with a conceptualization of weather as a lens through which to read literature and other media. My goal is to reflect on the role of literary and artistic practices in today's struggle against environmental degradation and climate change. My point of departure for this is a cliché, and the cliché is that the weather is no longer what it used to be. For sure, air and atmosphere were always affected by human actions, but the extent to which this is the case today is arguably unprecedented in human history. My project asks how such transformations have been addressed by Chinese fiction and media over the last decades, and in particular, I want to consider fog and the various terms associated with fog, such as mist, haze, smog, and so on, as a literary and artistic theme, as a metaphor, but also as a material element of the environment in which we live. I began to see a connection between literature and fog as I was reading a novel by the writer Ge Fei, published in 2011. But in fact, I will discuss Ge Fei's novel in the second part of this talk, because first I will start with a recent controversial documentary on air pollution. I'm sure all of you have heard of it. Under the Dome by Chai Jing. Under the Dome, in Chinese the title is 穹顶之下, was released on Saturday, February 28 this year, Saturday, February 28, at the same time, simultaneously on various video streaming sites. I list them here. And actually, it was also listed on the People's Daily. It quickly spread through social media, and it was allegedly watched by over 99 million people, or it was allegedly watched 99 million times. I say allegedly not because I underestimate this number, it's a huge number, but it's because we don't really know with social media, with films, documentaries circulating so quickly, we don't really know if we can say they're really watched in the sense of having been watched from beginning to end. But say they received almost 100 million clicks, and in 2 days. And then over the next few days, the film reached about 200 million hits, with tens of thousands of comments and heated debates online between viewers who praised it and those who attacked the filmmaker Chai Jing, questioning the truthfulness or accuracy of her narrative, her motivations, and also her source of funding. The timing of the release of the documentaries was quite crucial, as it happened just a few days before the meeting of National People Congress, which took place from March 5th to March 16th. Initially, official reactions to the documentary were quite positive. On Sunday, March 1st, the new Minister of Environmental Protection, Chen Jiannan, told the Beijing News that he had texted Ms. Chai, thanking her for the film, and he compared her to Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring, the expose on chemical pollution that galvanized the modern environmental movement in the United States. The website of the People's Daily also published a sympathetic interview with Miss Chai, and on that occasion she told the newspaper that she had financed the film herself, and she has spent on it about 1 million renminbi, which is about $160,000. And income came from this funding, came from her best-selling memoir, Bearing Witness, Kandian. So here we see the cover of this memoir, this book that she published in 2012, which actually sold over 1 million copies and received 12,000 customer reviews on Amazon. I'm telling all these numbers because I think it's important to think about Chai Jing already as a really prominent figure. She was already very well known, which may have played a role in the immediate popularity of the documentary. So even though initially the official response to the documentary was quite positive, within a week it was pulled down the internet. So authorities on March 7th ordered that it be removed from all websites, and so this is what we would see if you were searching for it. This decision is of course puzzling. I personally don't have any final opinion about why this is the case. It's always a matter of speculation, but perhaps some explanation could emerge if we take a close look to the documentary itself. Chai Jing, as I said, the documentary's author, is a much beloved and prize-winning TV reporter and host, and she's especially well known for her coverage of the SARS epidemic in 2003 and the Sichuan earthquake in 2008. She actually quit a job at Central Television in 2014, so she sort of made this film on her own when she was no longer working for China's television. But this is a very collaborative work. And so many of her collaborators actually are journals and editors, journalists, reporters who are still working with Chinese Central Television. The Chinese government refused to report fine particles until 2012, but since then, if you live in Beijing, you'll go online every morning and check what's the quantity of fine particles in the air this morning. I think it can go anywhere from, I mean, it's considered healthy, as you may know, up to 50. The average, I guess, in Beijing is, when I was there, at least it was last year, around 200, but there are days in which it gets up to 500. There are many important points that the documentary makes. It's very informative, but I just want to offer here a few observations on how Chai Jing delivers her message, that is, on the rhetorical strategies that make Under the Dome an extremely powerful documentary. As I mentioned before, it really interweaves the private and the public, and it employs narrative forms and media and images from all over the world and from different time periods. It includes animations, photographs, newsreel, and even a self-made cell phone video with a remarkable soundtrack emphasizing continuous shifts in tone and pace. So I want to talk about the strategies that she employs. One is just massive juxtaposition of several images of environmental pollutions from different places and time periods, all making the point that pollution has been an important problem, air pollution has been an important problem in Europe and in the United States, but Europe and the United States actually largely solved it. And now it's up to India and China and other developing countries to really deal with it. But one of the main strategies actually is to present the problem as a deeply personal matter. And this is a kind of, I think this is a kind of mobilization strategy. So I think what's behind this choice is really to think about not so much how do you provide information, but how do you get people interested in it, and how do you mobilize people in actually doing something. So this is, for instance, the beginning of the documentary where it's personal from the very first moment.
这是2013年1月份北京的 PM2.5曲线，1个月里头25天雾霾。我当时在北京，当我这一年里反复看这条曲线的时候，想回忆当时有什么印象、什么感觉，但是记不起来了。那时候大家都说好像这场雾霾是偶然的气象原因导致的，就没当回事儿。那个月里头我还去了4个地方出差：陕西、河南、江西、浙江。回头看视频里的天空，当时的中国正被卷入一场覆盖了25个省市和6亿人的大雾霾，但我置身其中，浑然不觉。只有我的嗓子有印象。在西安那天晚上就渴得睡不着觉，我就切了一只柠檬放在枕头边上。回到北京之后，我知道我怀孕了。这是我第一次见到她的样子。那时候我就觉得她应该是个小女孩，因为我觉得那是像个同花头。听到她的心跳的那一瞬间，我觉得我对她没有任何别的期望，健康就好。但是她被诊断为良性肿瘤，在出生之后就要接受手术。
So the ultrasound affords the viewer a look inside Chai Jing's body from the very first minute of the documentary, creating an immediate sense of intimacy. The intercutting between the image of herself, the ultrasound, and the concerned expression of audience members who are present in the studio elicits a strong sense of identification from viewers. She's not speaking in an authoritative expert mode, but as a witness, as a victim, as one of us. From the very first minute of the documentary, a main thematic thread emerges. The documentary, first and foremost, expresses an urgent call to save the children, a call that resonates with the famous last sentence of Lu Xun's Diary of a Madman in 1918, which is often referred to as China's first modern short story. Throughout the documentary, we're shown a great variety of graphs, but the graphs only go so far at telling a story and are generally here accompanied by some other element that helps deliver the information in a more effective manner. One prominent formal aspect of the documentary, and I don't know how common this is, it's certainly used also in An Inconvenient Truth, but this strikes me quite interesting the way it's done here. It's the use of cartoon as a tool of science popularization. So here in this clip, she's saying that she agreed to participate in an experiment in which doctors could observe the effect of fine particles onto her body. And so she gives us what kind of the technical terms that the doctors told her, but she says right away, I just don't understand what these words mean. And then we'll see that how the cartoon dramatizes and explains, popularizes the diagnosis of the doctors.
北大换了一种实验方式，他们就直接测试人们在日常生活中身体的反应，长达1年。我自己也参与和体验了这个实验，这是我得到的结果。我自己有呼吸道炎症，是易感人群。细颗粒物会影响呼吸系统，增加气道炎性反应，还会进一步影响心血管系统。超细颗粒物升高跟心脏供血能力降低有关系。这段话我念都念不通，因为我不明白是什么意思。所以在科学家的帮助下，我们把它做成了一个动画。
我是 PM2.5， 我的弟兄很多，多环芳烃，格力重金属，每一个都带着利器。在攻击人类的闯关游戏里，我很少失手。第一关，鼻孔，鼻毛和鼻涕能挡住外来异物，90%的直径大于10微米的颗粒物都在这里阵亡，但挡不住我们。第二关，咽喉，上呼吸道的纤毛10微米，1秒钟扇动20次，但我身体轻盈，器官平滑肌受到刺激，收缩试图阻挡我，这是自驱取路。第3关，下呼吸道，这里有像道长的大树一样密布的支气管，是我们最好的滑雪道。我们一路跟白细胞、淋巴细胞等交手混战，人类因此引发格力炎症。我们的大部队最终到达树杈尽头的肺泡。人类的肺泡有3亿多个，我们一旦挡住肺泡，人类就喘不过气。但这里有我们最可怕的敌人——巨噬细胞，它们专门吞噬异物，号称体内清道夫，这是一场恶战。但我们人多，而且有难以分解的内核，加上重金属的毒素，巨噬细胞很难消化，容易细胞器破裂而死。人类的免疫力就是这样下降的。我们还有一种刀锋战士，粒径小于0.5微米，可以穿过肺泡膜直接入血，沿途损伤血管内膜，让人血管变窄，血压升高，引发血栓。我们甚至可以通过肺循环来到人类的核心中枢，向你们的心脏发起总攻，造成心肌缺血，损伤心律混乱，引发心梗。战斗吧，人类！你们的每一颗呼吸，我都在。
So we are in every breath you take. Clearly, these are little monsters who are waging a war against humans. The narration emphasizes their multi-presence and their immense power. one important rhetorical strategy going on here is that of inverting the socialist rhetorics of humans waging war against nature. Actually, humans here have become utterly vulnerable. Another strategy of the documentary that contributes to its power is that of including a wide variety of interviews from people from business, political, and the scientific world, which together produce an authoritative and nuanced account that include a varieties of viewpoints and perspectives. And another characteristics, and this is a bit schematic, I just want to give a clear sense of how complex this documentary is that the voiceover mixes the language of numbers and hard data and the scientific discoveries with the evocation of something ungraspable, spectral, invisible, ghostly. Umai drifts above us like a ghost. So it is at the same time all too visible, but also incredibly elusive and ultimately ungraspable. There are also several rather lyrical sections that appeal to the nostalgia for a lost way of life. Either it is nostalgia for the specific weather of certain seasons, or it's nostalgia for old Beijing and neighborhood life. One other thing I want to mention is that similarly actually to An Inconvenient Truth, Under the Dome looks outside of the national borders for positive examples on how to deal with environmental degradations. The underlying message in both works actually is that the rest of the world does it better than us when it comes to implementing environmental regulations. Ironically, Al Gore claims in his work that cars produced in China are way more energy efficient, whereas Chai Jing finds that in California, environmental regulations are implemented much more thoroughly than in China. When it comes to solutions about what to do, however, their response is quite different. In An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore notes that in the US there is no political will to tackle the problem of climate change, but he insists that we as Americans are capable of dealing with the problem. Reviewing all the challenges and turning points that America underwent, for instance, he mentions we landed on the moon, we worked together to defeat communism. Gore appeals to the people as a nation that once again can come together and take a leading role in fighting this new challenge. Gore presents himself as a leader, and perhaps partly at least as a solution to the problem. The subtext there is, if only he had been elected, he would have taken proper action. The political thrust of An Inconvenient Truth then falls within the logic of the representational democracy. There's surely something that individuals can do against climate change, and one of these things is to elect those who will care enough to implement adequate regulations. In the different context of contemporary China, where there are no elections, Under the Dome concludes with a much more radical message. It's a call to act right now, and to become part of a longer history of environmental activism that knows no geographical borders and encompasses the whole world. There's no emphasis of we Chinese as a nation in Chai Jing's documentary. The goal is to steer every single individual to immediate action, but it's a global rhetoric that it's used to reach this goal. And I'm really curious later in the Q&A if you would tell me what you think about this sequence. I don't watch much TV actually, so I don't know how common this is for TV documentaries, but I find it quite powerful.
所以回头来看人类与污染的之间的战争，历史就是这样创造的，就是千千万万个普通人，有一天他们会说不，我不满意， 我不想等待，我也不再推诿，我要站出来做一点什么。我要做的事情就在此时，就在此刻，就在此地，就是此生。
Unless we do bring these chemicals under better control, we are certainly headed for disaster.
This whole system that we call home.
喘息患者らが国や東京都自動車メーカーなどに車の排気ガスによる被害の損害賠償などを求めた東京大気汚染訴訟で
大家连接在一起，去共同做出我们这一代人的一个绿色的选择。
If you don't know how to fix it, please stop breaking it. You've grown up say you love us. Please make your actions. And for me, it is absolutely my responsibility then to do whatever it takes to protect my child.
So I think there is something quite stirring in these images, and it's quite remarkable, the kind of breadth that it encompasses and the kind of transnational, global, and also historical perspective that it brings to a problem that that every single individual is called to try to find a solution for. But I'm going to shift gears now. My point in presenting this is partly to say simply that I think this is a personal, compelling personal documentary that radically departs from previous depictions of smog and haze in contemporary China. Broadening up the discussion to not only to fog but as weather and air, as a kind of theme, what do we find if we look back and try to think of it as a theme of visual representation but also of literary representation? If we go back in time, we find that in the literature and visual culture of socialist China, atmospheric states were actually mostly invoked as metaphors of political situations or human qualities. So elements of the sky were the expression of class power or constituted a temporary challenge to humans' triumph over nature, or were the conveyors of an impending threat. I'm thinking, for instance, of the red radiant sun in propaganda posters in Mao's China, or in some movies there would be some nightly storm in which enemies would come out of their dens. This is in socialist movies. Then in the post-Mao period, terms related to the air have often been used to suggest certain literary qualities or a shift in the boundaries of political discourse. So again, it's a kind of metaphorical usage of terms connected to air. For instance, you would have misty in misty poetry, which alluded to a lack of communicative clarity and a sort of depressive tenor. Or images of blue sky in the short fiction of the early 1980s tended to suggest hope and optimism. And also times of more liberal cultural policies were described with the attributes of spring, which would sometimes be followed by abrupt gusts of cold wind. So in all these cases, atmospheric elements were used to indicate some kind of figural expression of human struggles and moods, or some kind of cultural characteristic of a certain time. There is one recent literary work, however, I want to talk about today, in which the sensorial elements that make up the weather, in particular fog and haze, take center stage and demand to be read both literally as a material element of the environment, but also as tropes. So the work I'm going to talk now sort of to present another case of how fog has been represented in contemporary literature and media is Ge Fei's End of Spring in Jiannan, which was published in 2011 and is the third volume of a trilogy, the Jiannan trilogy. End of Spring in Jiannan centers on the question of how one can find a clean place to live and die within the pervasive toxicity of post-socialist capitalism, at the same time exploring what the very condition of post-socialism or post-socialist capitalism entails for individuals. Fog here serves as a medium connecting four manifestations of toxicity: shame, sacrifice, surplus, and crime. We'll see how that works later. So before illustrating these claims, I will talk briefly about the trilogy as a whole. The Jiannan trilogy departs from Ge Fei's previous works in the ways it portrays the relationship between individuals and their historical context. In Ge Fei's early works, a fundamental incommensurability divided the well-known narratives of major historical events from concrete human experience, which is often motivated by sexual desire. So there was a kind of gap between the historical background and the narratives about the particular historical moment in which the characters live and their own motivation, and also their own actions. In the Jiannan trilogy, however, this gap between the historical narratives defining an epoch and the protagonists' lives narrows, and the characters' aspirations are more directly related to the collective expectations of their age. These characters are actively involved in the major transformations of their times and in some ways typify them. The 3 volumes of the trilogy are set around 3 important moments in modern Chinese history: the 1911 revolution, the mid-1950s, and the 2000s. Although the main protagonists belong to successive generations of one family throughout the trilogy, the focus is not on extended family relations, but on immediate kin and the broader social world. Weaving together such diverse documents as local gazetteers, letters, and online chats, and combining a variety of genres, the 3 volumes are all set in one specific place. This is primarily a work about Zhenjiang in Jiangsu province, where the author grew up. So it bears affinities with Xiantu Wenxue, or native soil literature, and many other contemporary novels set in the author's home region. You may think of Mo Yan's novels, for instance, set in Shandong province. But here, in the Jiannan trilogy, there's no heroic past or ancestors to look back to, and there is no nostalgic storytelling. Why write a trilogy? Narratives that extend beyond the length of a novel are fairly common in contemporary Chinese literary culture. The Jiannan trilogy, for one, calls attention to the enduring consequences of ideas and actions that sediment in the soil and the sky, despite a political discourse that insists on a fractured temporality of ever new leaps forward. In each of the moments it covers, it returns to aspirations that are never neatly fulfilled, questioning conventional narratives of overcoming. No character appears in more than one volume, however, suggesting historical changes so radical that are not conceivable within one single consciousness. The expansive form of the trilogy then foregrounds the interplay of the enduring and the contingent at diverse historical junctures and the incompleteness of any process of prevailing over an uncomfortable past. The first volume interrogates the concept of utopia that inspired revolutionary movements around 1911. The second engages the vicissitudes of an idealist communist cadre in the early 1950s. And the third offers a trenchant critique of capitalism that does not find resolution in a recuperation of leftist politics. The trilogy is not invested, however, in evaluating socialism and capitalism as contrasting economic and political systems, but rather in reconsidering the nature of their promises and the ways in which these promises propel individuals to act. The core promise of Chinese socialism, the first and second volumes suggest, was to put an end to the precariousness of all aspects of life through the redistribution of economic surplus, but also through the rechanneling of emotional excess. Socialist planning aimed to end material scarcity and create forms of intimacy that would be more solid than other bonds, promising not only material abundance, but also lasting affection and reciprocity, a solidarity that would replace all previous relationships. The Jiannan trilogy retells the story of these promises of intimacy and abundance, showing how fragile they were from their very inception. In each of the three volumes, planning is an important element of the plot, from the tentative planning of revolutionary action in the first novel to planning as a feature of the centralized economy in the second, to the waning possibility of organizing one's life in the third. But in each of the novels, the possibility of planning remains subjected to contingencies and sudden twists that no one can control. If planning is always an elusive goal rather than a secured means, the sheer belief in the possibility of planning becomes unavailable in the third volume. Thus, the trilogy traces the waning of a belief rather than the exhaustion of an actual practice. In End of Spring in Jiannan, in the third volume, that is, rather than planning, various forms of interruption and blockage created by emotional or material excess constitute the main mechanisms regulating social and economic life. Fog, as we shall see, works precisely as a trope of interruption or blockage. Stretching over 12 months from May to April, sometimes between 2006 and 2009, and encompassing recollections mostly revolving around 1989, End of Spring in Jiannan depicts a diseased social world that is the culmination of economic restructuring begun in the 1990s, characterized by real estate speculation, loss of lifelong employment, displacement of the weak, commodification of life. These are transformations that obviously concern the totality of China, but the area of Zhenjiang, where the novel is set, constitutes an extreme case of pollution and environmental destruction. Here we see a real picture of Zhenjiang. So I was saying that the area of Zhenjiang constitutes an extreme case of pollution and environmental destruction, and this is a quote from the novel. Capital is like a hurricane blowing all over mid-spring Jiannan, dressing up decay with coats that seemed fancy and trendy, but were just pretentious and ill-fitting. End of Spring in Jiannan tackles a sense of displacement that occurs not when one leaves one's country to go abroad, but rather when facing a familiar landscape that has been utterly transformed. The novel elaborates on aspirations eroded by the promises that nurtured them, registering the uncertain possibilities offered by this kind of present, more opportunities to reinvent oneself from scratch, but less security, and an ultimate failing on the part of individuals to exert control over their bodies and surroundings. A diffuse precariousness is presenting as a basic condition of human life, independent of social status. End of Spring in Jiannan traces the total, nearly total at least, erosion of expectations of a better future life. The story begins with a one-night encounter between the poet Tan Duanwu and a young woman named Xiurong in 1989 in Hepu, a fictional town in Jiangsu province. The two lose touch immediately, but meet again in a department store a year and a half later and marry soon thereafter. The narrative present is set about 20 years later. Duanwu now works in a dusty office for the compilation of local gazetteers, whereas Xiurong has changed her ethereal name into the materialist-sounding Jiayu, or House Jade, and undertaken a successful career as a lawyer. So various permutations of fog punctuate Duanwu's life and writing, accompanying a coming-of-age process that involves a growing awareness of evil as well as displacement from an idyllic neighborhood to an overbuilt city. In Duanwu's earlier poetry, mist or ulan signifies the immaterial, the imaginary, purity and heightened pathos. It is associated with nostalgia for pristine landscapes and with childhood. That fine mist, reduced to an anachronism surviving only in a dictionary, has now been replaced by granular substance that precipitates on the fictional page. The text here offers a self-reflexive comment on the various terms used to denote this substance, calling our attention to how language itself responds to environmental mutation through a changing semantic field in which some terms become obsolete and some are newly coined with the purpose of distinguishing, with the purpose of disguising reality rather than revealing it. It will be recalled, for instance, that actually the word umai was newly adopted in 1997 official documents to describe Beijing's pollution, what up until that point was called uran, pollution. And in fact, the word did not come into popular use in the media until 2012. This mysterious umai, or fog haze, is thus both a material aspect of environment and a warning, an allegory. The passage that I just read traces a repetitive relay between the experiential and the allegorical, with every new compound denoting an accretion of substance that turns attraction into disgust, registering a shift from the soft mistiness enshrouding childhood recollections to a toxic dust that by itself, almost automatically, seeps into the writing. Fog thus becomes intertwined with crime and with shame. The connection with crime first occurs to Duanwu after watching Alain Resnais's documentary Night and Fog in the late 80s. Made in 1955, the documentary was commissioned by the Comité d'Histoire de la Seconde Guerre mondiale to memorialize concentration camps and was co-authored with Jean Carroll, who had been in one of the camps as political prisoner. The title of the documentary draws on Carroll's book, Poems of Night and Fog, which in turn refers to Hitler's 1941 Night and Fog decree, mandating that political dissenters in countries occupied by Nazi Germany would be secretly arrested and deported to concentration camps, and that no information on their whereabouts would be communicated to their families. Fog in that documentary evokes atrocities committed in the dark, willful repression of truth, and the shunning of accountability in post-war France. Duanwu's mention of Night and Fog occurs just after Jiayu has left home. She has cancer, as I said, and wants to die in a remote hospital. So this contraposition creates a contrast between two different kinds of crime. The first involving brutal violence, the second more hidden, but infiltrating the human body in more capillary and equally pernicious ways. The more diffused nature of crime in the present renders the issue of accountability even more fraught. Indeed, Duanwu's ensuing reflection on fog transforms the question of accountability raised by Resnais's documentary into one that is more closely related to acquiescence. So what strikes the protagonist of this novel is how is it possible that umai is accepted as natural? What kind of language then can adequately respond to such toxic opaqueness of air? This question of language animates not only Duanwu's own writing, but also the novel as a whole. And The Spring in Jiannan nourishes itself on poisonous dusts, for the residue that kill is also what instigates writing. No longer the realm of poetic invention and romantic recollection, literary prose aspires to resemble the video camera recording Jiayu leaving home, an imprint that aggressively overrides the translucent remainder of gentler mists. And The Spring in Jiannan repeatedly depicts the granular texture of air to denounce not only the deterioration of the landscape, but also the damage to the body. Ge Fei's prose thus transfers opacity from the psychological depth of the self to the dynamics that attend to bodily transformations, from the ambivalence of feeling to the turbidity of matter. This matter encompasses both the human and the non-human, the organic and inorganic. Recall, for instance, the words ashen, hairy, filthy fog that Cicely bred crime and shame in his heart. At the close of the earlier quotations, here the hairy appearance of the fog suggests a growth in which the boundary between the inorganic and the organic is unclear. The fog itself retains an organic quality. It's the condensed residue of human actions, and it is the residual quality that allows it to enter in osmotic relation with the heart, infecting Duanwu with a sense of crime and shame. Fog, in sum, works here as an infectious agent, at the same time as it makes contagion visible, calling attention to questions of accountability and acquiescence, both as a self-reflective commentary on the work of the writer and in broad social terms. But fog also nurtures enduring aspirations for a clean place, even as it obscures the landscape. To conclude, in End of Spring and Jiannan, fog serves as a medium that both nurtures and obscures the search for a clean place to live and die. Fog signifies insecurity, toxic excess, and the loss of foresight and insight because of the clouding of all lines of vision. Even so, the very act of writing about fog is animated by an aspiration to clarity, metaphorically and otherwise. Fog is the remainder of the mediated nature of experience and communication, but the novel also suggests that the poetic employment of a misty language is inadequate to the demands of the present. So the novel is animated by an effort to communicate and the desire for transparency that is engendered by the very ominous thickening of the air. So both, to conclude, both in the documentary that we've seen at the beginning and in the novel, fog renews the desire for vision. In an article titled "The Cloud of Knowing, Blurring the Difference with China," the scholar of philosophy, Barry Allen, comments on early Chinese texts on military tactics, noting that for Chinese thought, the fog of war is a cloud of knowing rather than unknowing. Blur is not an inchoate condition from which one emerges as it dissipates with the relief. Either, to the contrary, this fog can be known and operated with, despite it seeming like anything but an object, unreified, unmappable, borderless, immeasurable, vague, subtle, unsettled, and so on. Therefore, it's a condition of strategic blindness, and it's rather an advantage. So Allen continues, not for a moment does the Chinese knows anything about it. He has learned to navigate its tenuous medium, to respond to it, to its resonance and change when it changes. Of course, there is no reason why these observations on early Chinese thought should be relevant to contemporary China, and yet they are inspiring insofar as they raise the possibility of reading fog and atmosphere in general in different ways. So I'll leave with the question as what do we see when we focus on fog that we would not see otherwise? Thank you.